Hi everyone, Matt here from Proof Fly Fishing. In today's video we are going to prepare our wraps to be sealed. We're going to start by burnishing the wraps, which is just a way of polishing the thread to make sure that you get a very smooth, low profile surface before we apply the finish. And then we're going to have a discussion about various color preservers, how they work, what they do, what the final result is. When you want to use them, when you may not want to. And then we're going to finish up with varnishing our wraps. This is going to be kind of a multi-step process, but we're going to take you through start to finish and how to do that. And today we're using spar varnish, and we're just using disposable plastic brushes. You want to make sure that, again, they're silicone free. It's always a good idea in rod building to avoid silicone. But so that's all you're going to really need. Something to burnish. This is a burnisher that we sell, but if you have any smooth, hard, like plastic, a Bic pen, if you avoid the writing on it, can work as a burnisher. Something to polish the thread. You want spar varnish. Full strength is fine to start off with, and we'll talk about cutting it a little bit later. And then some sort of color preserver. You want to make sure your color preserver matches the thread you're using. So if you're using nylon, we have a color preserver for that. If you're using silk, you'll definitely want to use a different color preserver specifically designed for silk. But we're going to switch to a close-up now, and we're going to talk about how to prepare a wrap for varnish and color preserver. See you in a minute. Okay, we're back. What we have in front of us here is a guide that's wrapped with nylon thread, and what we want to do is kind of prep this, and then we're going to apply color preserver to it. In a minute I'm going to show you the difference between a wrap that has color preserver and one that doesn't when we apply varnish in just a few minutes here. But so to prep this wrap, a couple things to look for, and a couple things you might worry about that you don't need to. One, there's a tiny little bump here. You might be able to see it. That's where we did our pull loop. It's creating just a small bump. Don't worry about that. If there's a little tag end, if when you cut that tag end it wasn't quite perfect, that's okay too. You know, get it as close as you can. We talked about, you know, laying that razor blade right parallel to the guide and just kind of slightly sawing it off. If you've done that and you still have a small little tag end there, at this point we're not going to worry about it, but we will treat it a little bit later once we get a couple coats of varnish on. So what we want to do now, you know, when you wrap a soft material like thread around a blank, what you're doing in some cases on a microscopic level is breaking those fibers up as you bend them. So it's nice to take some sort of burnishing tool and just polish that wrap. What we're doing with this is we're taking those loose fibers and we're just flattening them, burnishing them down. Now where you want to be careful, and in particular if you use, this wrap doesn't have a trim band, but if it did have a trim band, they can be very delicate, and if you start like polishing over top of them too vigorously, you'll loosen it, it'll come off, or it'll separate from the main wrap. So just be very careful. I usually stick to the main wrap. I don't even try to do the trim wraps because I don't think there's much benefit in doing it, and you just risk damaging it. That's all I do for burnishing. Another way you can do this to deal with that kind of microscopic fibers is you can take a Q-tip and dip it in rubbing alcohol, light it, and then very carefully kind of hover it underneath the wrap, moving it around constantly, and just lightly singe it. And I mean very lightly. You don't want to burn the thread. We just want to kind of take off any of those very small fuzzies that might not even be visible on this level. So once we have that done, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how to apply color preserver. Now what color preserver is going to do is it's going to keep this wrap opaque. You notice you can see where the guide foot is, but you can't see the guide foot through the thread right now. Now if we were to put finish on this, either varnish or Threadmaster, what would happen is this thread would go semi-transparent and you'd be able to see the guide foot through it. Now some people like that look, and I think it's great in some applications, but if you want this wrap to stay opaque, then you need to use color preserver. And the important thing with color preserver is to use one that matches the thread that you're using. In this case, it's nylon. On the store, we carry both one for nylon and for silk. So you just, it's pretty simple. You pick the one that corresponds to the thread you're using. I use a plastic brush to apply it. And I'm going to be pretty generous with how I apply this. I'll start, in the center of the wrap. Don't worry too much about the bubbles there. Those are going to disappear, and we're going to brush it out. And go ahead and load that brush up. And we want to get a good heavy coverage on this wrap. And then I like to rotate it, making sure that we get all the edges. We're going to go onto the blank just a little bit. Same with the other side. I just kind of push that color preserver over, making sure we get really solid coverage. And then one part I want to point out here, right where the wire of that guide goes under the thread, you get what are called tunnels. A tunnel is a small kind of gap on either side of that wire where the thread kind of lifts off it. And you want to make sure when you're doing color preserver and later on finish that you get plenty of that material inside those tunnels. And what you have is called the capillary effect. So you'll put some finish on it and that tunnel will just suck it right in. And then you'll want to apply a little bit more. You can do this with a brush, or you can use a needle or a toothpick or another tool to kind of get real precise. But make sure you get that covered well. What I like to do then is I'll leave, you can see how much is on there. There's too much right now, but I want to get good saturation. So if I had other guides wrapped on this blank, what I would do is I would put this amount of color preserver on each of them, and then I come back and I take the same brush, this time without any color preserver on it, and I just kind of rotate that, going over it, wiping it off, cleaning my brush, going over again, and taking off that excess. You'll notice that the thread is quite a bit darker at this point, and that color will level out as this material dries. It's okay to have a little bit extra on there like that because it's going to dry clear, so nothing to worry about. But you just don't want it sagging. You want to take off any extra things that might drip as it sits there. So that's it. That's applying color preserver. If I'm doing nylon, I like to do 3 coats, sometimes 4 coats, depending on the size of the guide. The larger the guide, like a stripping guide, I'll usually do 4 coats just to make sure I get really good coverage. I usually do an hour between coats, so you can do 4 coats in roughly 4 hours. And then after the final coat, I let it sit and dry at least 24 hours before I apply finish to it. And then you should be good to go. If I were doing silk, then I would do probably 5 or 6 coats. Silk is a lot more sensitive and it'll pick up varnish or rod finish if it's not sealed 100%. So you just have to be a little more careful, add a few extra layers, and then again make sure it's good and dry before you go to apply your finish. But that's it on color preserver. Now we're going to switch over to another part of the blank where I have a wrap that's actually, we'll move to it right now. What we have here, this side has color preserver applied, 3 coats, and this side is completely untreated. So in a minute we're going to mix up some varnish. I'm going to thin our varnish just a little bit so we get nice good clean coverage on it. And then I'm going to show you the difference between what happens with a wrap without color preserver versus one that has it. So we'll get to that in just a minute. I'm going to mix up some varnish and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, we're back. We're going to mix our varnish now. So we're using spar varnish. This is the Man of War spar varnish. And what we're going to use is a pipette just to withdraw a little of it, and we're going to put it in our mixing cup. And then we're going to do equal parts, roughly equal parts, with naphtha or a paint thinner that's going to allow this varnish to thin out so we get a nice clean coat. So you don't need a tremendous amount, especially for the first coats, because they're just going to get absorbed into that finish. There we go. I'll show you how much I have in there. You can notice it's just a very little amount on the bottom of that cup. So now we're going to add our paint thinner. Make sure you do this in a well-ventilated area. Stuff can be kind of toxic. So again, roughly an equal amount of paint thinner added to it. You want to get a new brush, and then I just take our brush and we just mix those two elements together, and it's going to be roughly the consistency of water. That's what you're going for. You can see if I were to put it on a brush, it just drips right off, which is how we like it, nice and thin. We're going to get our blank back up here. Let me zoom in a little bit for you so you can see that. Okay, so again we have two wraps here. This one is treated with color preserver, and this one has nothing on it. So when we go to apply our first coats of varnish, it's okay to go a little bit heavy because that thread is going to really take it up. So I start in the middle of the wrap, and with a slight circular motion, I rotate that rod, just kind of pushing that varnish to the edges. And then I'll work it back the other way. You can see a little drop forming on the bottom of the wrap. Not a problem at all. We're going to take care of that in a minute. Another thing you want to do, just like we did before, is make sure you treat those tunnels. I like to use a needle or a toothpick to get in there. So now we have that first coverage on. We're going to grab our brush and just kind of take off any excess that might be on the bottom. You can rotate it a little bit, pulling some of that excess off. Just like that. Now, you'll notice on the top, I'm getting a little bit of reflection, but I cannot see the guide foot through there. When that dries, that wrap is going to be opaque. So let's try the one without any color preserver on it. And again, you're not going to get too dramatic of a difference while this is wet. But when it dries, it'll have a much different look to it. Again, I kind of start in the center and I just push that varnish around. You can add a little bit more so you get like a bead on the end of that brush. And you just push it around right to the edge. If you want to go a little bit over the edge to make sure you get good coverage, that's fine too. Just like that. And this time I had enough on there where it just filled in those tunnels all by itself. It's very difficult to see, and I'm going to spin it, kind of pulling off any extra that might be there. We don't want any sags on this finish. We want a nice thin coat. Just like that. Now, once you get this coat on, what you're going to want to do, if you have a rod dryer, go ahead and throw it on the rod dryer and rotate it for about 2 hours. If you don't, the nice thing about varnish is that you just rotate it by hand. Set a timer, put on a movie or something, put it in a spot of your house where it doesn't get a lot of traffic, and rotate it a quarter turn every 15 minutes for about 2 hours, and that varnish will have set up to the point where it will no longer sag on you. So 15 minutes, quarter turn, and just keep doing that until that varnish dries. It's really it. And then what you want to do then, you'll notice after this first coat is on, you'll still be able to see the texture of the thread through that coat. And keep applying additional coats. I keep it thin. I usually keep the same mixture, roughly 1 to 1. And Just keep applying more and more coats, you know, depending on how thick you make your mixture. Usually takes me, if I'm using color preserver, I take less coats. It usually takes 3 coats to get a nice clean finish. If I'm not using color preserver, it'll take a few more, maybe 4, maybe 5 coats. You can start to see, as this varnish is setting up, the difference here. I can see the dark guide foot through this one, whereas on this one, it's still opaque. But that's really it. Varnish is pretty straightforward. Just nice thin coats, 2-hour rotation, thin it roughly 1 to 1, and you should be all set. You can apply as many coats as you want to get a nice clean surface on there, and just make sure you remove any excess so you don't get a sag. The final part of this video, we're going to talk about what happens if once you get a few coats on and it's dried, it's been maybe 24 hours, and you go to feel that wrap and you feel something kind of sharp, and what it is like a little tag end that has gotten stuck in the varnish and is just kind of making that wrap a little bit rough. So we'll switch to that right now. I have another sample wrap here that has some exaggerated trim pieces of the of the end that are of that thread that are just sticking through. So you can see those. Hopefully when you trim your wrap, this is not the case that you get them this large, but if it is, there's an easy solution. All you need to do is take your razor blade, once you have maybe 2 or 3 coats of varnish on, and those tag ends are nice and stiff from the varnish, you come in just like before and you just shear those off. Just like that. Make sure you remove them. And then what you can do, you come in again with your varnish and you just do an additional coat. And let it dry and check to make sure that you don't get any bumps where those tag ends were before you cut them off. And if you still get a little one, you can see right on the top there, I still have a little bump there from where that tag end was showing through. What I would do, I'd let this harden again, give it 2 hours, and then I'd come in with my razor blade and just lightly shear that off, and then apply 1 additional coat, and you should be all set. So those are pretty dramatic. Usually you won't have them that big. Generally one time you'll shear off that tag end, 1 additional coat, and you should be all set to go. So that's it. That's how to seal your wraps. It's pretty straightforward with varnish. No mixing, no need for long-term rotation. In our next video, we are going to finish the rod. We're going to install the reel seat and talk a little bit more about how to get a good alignment between the reel seat and the rest of the blank. All right, thanks. We'll see you next time.